as an ex-Mormon, and we can talk about even the similarities between the ex-Mormon videos and the Jehovah's Witness videos, because as I always say, we're like brother, sister, cousin cults. We have very similar rules. And actually, some of the theology is pretty close too, which is interesting. So it's always very fun to talk to ex-Jehovah's Witnesses.
Absolutely agree. We are very much cousin cults. We kind of formed out in the same time period, give or take. I've actually looked into the history of this a lot, and it's super fascinating. I just love the history of like the Bible and, you know, cults of various different sorts. Mormonism formed out in the 1820s or 1830s. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like kind of iffy when it technically started, but yeah, around 1832.
Yeah, well, Jehovah's Witnesses were originally part. The founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Taze Russell, was part of a group called the Millerite movement. They don't exist anymore, but in the mid-1800s, there's this thing called the Great Disappointment, where everybody believed that the end was going to come. We got this apocalyptic thing revving everybody up into this blood frenzy, sell all your stuff, you know. 1843 rolls around and nothing happened, of course.
Whoops.
And that was like... Yeah, that was the last straw for the Millerites because he'd already made predictions beforehand and nothing came of it. So Jehovah's Witnesses founder, Charles Taze Russell, is part of that movement. And as time goes on, he's attending Millerite churches that kind of reformed into a new group that believed Millerites had the right idea with their Bible math, but they just had the variables wrong. He recreates this Bible math with brand new variables, and then he starts prophesying the end in the exact same way. So Millerites started out with the 1840s, and Charles Taze Russell, founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, in the 1870s officially started Jehovah's Witnesses about 40, 50 years after Mormonism was, you know, getting its start in full, I think.
Yeah.
And he just continued on to prophesy end time prediction after end time prediction through the 1870s, 80s, 90s. Then 1913, 1914, he pulled all the same tricks the Millerites did. And it just failed and failed and failed. And, you know, they had, even after Charles Taze Russell left, even after he died, Halloween night, 1916, his successor went on to prophesy even more stuff. It's just absurd how people get sucked into this, you know? Of course, I was born into it, so I guess I can't blame myself too much for being a member. But
yeah, it's interesting how when there's these failed prophecies, they just say, well, you guys weren't worthy enough, or I guess the Lord has given us a second chance, or whatever they say, and it actually makes them double down more on their faith, which is interesting. And I think it's just another manipulation tactic. So as far as your experience growing up as a child, what were some of the things that really stood out to you as far as I am different from other people because?
Well, let me start from the beginning with it. It was actually Jehovah's Witnesses very much attempt to separate their members from everybody else because of one Bible verse that says you should live in the world but not be a part of it. So of course they take that opportunity to interpret that in the most extreme way imaginable and try to separate their members any way they can. And that meant when I was in school, when I was fifth grade, I think, there was a Valentine's Day celebration, for example. This is just like one holiday out of one of my years. Kids were making little pouches to put on the sides of desks, you know, and they give each other Valentines and everything. I was left out of that. I was not allowed to participate because I was a Jehovah's Witness. So everybody else got Valentines. I did not because of my religion. That's just one example of the ways in which Jehovah's Witnesses have become acclimated, for lack of a better term, to being completely separate from everybody else. And when you're little, you don't fully realize how negatively this is affecting you. You don't really realize it until after you exit and you see the world for what it is. You see what other people are doing and realize that you're missing out on a lot, not just missing out on fun, but missing out on a piece of culture that you live in. You know, I didn't get to celebrate my first Christmas until I was 18 years old when I finally ended up leaving the religion. So there was a lot lost in that process, unfortunately. If you want, I can go on to tell more of the story. Do you want to hear more of it?
Yeah, before you continue, I have one more question, or a quick question.
Sure.
So I find it interesting that you're not able to celebrate any holidays that even have to do with Jesus, like Christmas, because you do still worship Jesus, right?
Yes. Well, fascinatingly, Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, I'm not a member anymore. I have no love for the religion. I think it's absolutely terrible in every way. But, and you know, it's done irreparable harm to countless people, including myself. But they are actually, they get some things correct. And they use those things that they get correct as a method of bolstering their credibility in other areas, right?
Okay.
So, for example, the teaching of the Trinity or the teaching of hellfire, those are actually, those were not believed by early Christians, like by Jesus. He did not believe in those things. December 25th is actually not when Jesus was born, for example. So you can tell somebody, you know, this isn't when Jesus was born. You can tell somebody hell isn't actually in the Bible or whatever, and they'll go home and they'll read about it and they'll say, check that out. Jehovah's Witnesses were right about this, and automatically assume they're right about all the rest of it. So
Right. So they use that to their advantage. That's so interesting. Okay, so what are some other things that stood out to you about your childhood?
I had a generally a pretty normal Jehovah's Witness childhood, not a normal childhood in general, but when I was about 8 years old, I lived in Connecticut leading up to that. I was 8. I moved out of Connecticut, moved to West Virginia because my dad got in a car accident. We were completely separated from everybody that we had known in Connecticut. We had built a social network in Connecticut of other Jehovah's Witnesses. But when we moved to West Virginia, we didn't have that social network of other Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, we went to the Kingdom Hall and we got to meet a lot of them, but it's a much more sparsely populated area, for lack of a better term, which means there aren't as many kids in the congregation. There aren't as many people to hang out with or whatever. And that led to extreme social isolation for me. That's not the case with every Jehovah's Witness because their parents have likely had time to build that social network. But it was definitely the case with me, and it's the case with a lot of them.